On the 22nd of January 1924, at 7:15 in the morning, a man named Isham Toulson walked out onto a mud flat on the Mattaquin River, carrying a long-handled wooden shovel over one shoulder, and began, very carefully, to spread around the garbage that had been dumped there to ruin him. The tide was dead low and falling still. Behind him, up on the pilings of the Skiffington packing house, 4 men stood with coffee going cold in their hands and watched him do it. They had been watching for 6 days by then. What they saw was a man in canvas braces and a navy wool shirt, knee-deep in a drift of white oyster shell that was not his, working it out flat across gray mud with the patience of somebody smoothing a bed. One of them laughed and said it was the saddest thing he ever expected to see on that river. The shell had come off a dredge boat. It had come off in scowloads, 39 of them across 2 months, each load dumped in the same place at the same stage of the tide, until 14 acres of leased bottom that a man had paid rent on since 1911 lay under a bank of dead shell 6 feet high in the middle and thinning out to nothing at the edges. It was not an accident, and nobody in Treadway County pretended it was. It was a message written in the only alphabet the river understood, and every waterman on the Mattaquin could read it, and it said, "There is nothing here for you anymore. Go somewhere else." Isham Toulson read it too. Then he went home, ate his supper, slept, got up, and went out with a shovel. That is where I want to start, because that is the part that makes no sense yet. A man does not thank a hand that buries him. And whatever else you might guess about what happened out on that flat over the next 5 years, I promise you it is not the thing you are guessing, and it is not luck either. Stay with me and you will see the whole of it. If you find yourself the kind of person who slows down for a story like this one, go ahead and subscribe. I put a new one up every week, and I would be glad of the company now. Back up a little. Freetown Neck sat on the low south shore where the Mattaquin bent east toward the bay. 1.25 miles of sand road, 20-odd houses, a church, and a landing where 6 dead rise boats were tied bow out because there was not room to swing them any other way. It had been settled after the war by people who bought the only ground anybody would sell them, which was ground that flooded. The gardens there were built up in ridges. The chicken houses stood on blocks. Everyone in the neck understood, without ever once needing it explained, that the reason they lived where they lived was that this was the peace nobody else had wanted, and the reason they made a living at all was that the water in front of it did not care whose name was on the deed. Isham Toulson was 41 that January. He had a boat, a set of 19-foot hand tongs, a daughter of 16 named Vashti who culled for him, and a wife he had buried in the fall of 1919 when the influenza came up the river on the mailboat and took 11 people out of the neck in 9 days. He did not talk about that. He talked about tides, and he had the lease. Here is a thing that people forget about the Chesapeake, and it explains nearly everything that follows. In 1894, the state of Virginia finished a survey of its oyster grounds. A long, expensive, argued-over piece of work that drew a line around every natural oyster rock in Tidewater and set those rocks aside forever as public bottom, free to any licensed man with hand tongs and a boat. Everything outside that line was declared barren. Barren bottom could be rented from the state. 2 acres or 200 at a fixed yearly rent, and a man who rented it could plant it and could keep whatever grew there. It sounded generous, and for a certain kind of man it was. But the natural rocks were already the good ground by definition, and what was left to lease was mud, sand, soft bottom, and the dead spots between. The whole system worked out to a simple arrangement that no one had to say out loud. Everybody could tong the public rocks, and only a man with money could afford to wait 3 years on a piece of leased barren. Assignment number 217, Treadway County, was 14 acres of soft gray bottom off the Freetown Flats, and it had been rented in 1911 by a woman named Delphi Cuffey. She was 73 in 1924, and she had been the best tonger in the neck for 30 years, which everyone acknowledged, and nobody wrote down. She had worked a public rock called 9-Foot Knoll from 1881 until 1909, and in 1909 the county surveyor and 2 men from the packing house re-walked the bailer line at 9-Foot Knoll and discovered, after 15 years of nobody discovering it, that the line had been drawn 30 rods too far east. The rock came out of public bottom. It went into a lease. The lease went to Skiffington and Son. Delphi Cuffey, who had no lawyer and no standing and no way in the world to argue with a chain and a transit, took the $91 she had saved and rented 14 acres of barren mud, because barren mud was what was left. She had never made it pay. She said so herself, flatly, the way she said everything. Ground's got no bones in it, she told Isham, the first time he went out on it with her. Nothing for anything to hold to. It's just soft all the way down. She had married his wife's aunt's brother, which in the neck made her family. And when her hands went at 68, she signed the assignment over to Isham to hold in her name, and she went on paying attention to it the way people pay attention to a thing they have not forgiven. $17.50 a year, at $1.25 the acre. He paid it every January. For 13 years it bought him nothing but a place to tie up out of the wind. Now the reason Skiffington and Son wanted those 14 acres in the winter of 1924 was not spite, whatever the neck said, and I will get to their side of it in full, because they had one. It is enough for the moment to say that Latimer Skiffington was 58 years old, that he had 206 people shucking in his house at the peak of the season, that his supply of planting ground was running short, and that assignment 217 sat directly between two pieces he already held. He offered $400 for the transfer in November. Isham said the lease was not his to sell. Skiffington asked whose it was then, and Isham told him, and Skiffington looked out the window for a while and said that was a shame. In December, the dredge boat started coming. Her name was on her transom in letters, so weathered you could not read them from 30 feet, and her captain was a stocky, red-faced, restless man of 34 named Pinckney Bradish, whom everyone on both shores called Pink. The Bradish brothers dredged for Skiffington under contract, and part of that contract was hauling off the shucking house's shell pile, which by January stood higher than the roof and stank in any weather above 40 degrees. Where a shell pile went was nobody's business. It went overboard somewhere. Now it went overboard in one particular place. Pink Bradish leaned on his wheel the first morning, watched the scow tip, watched the white cloud of it go down through 8 feet of green water onto Delphiki Cuffey's barren mud, and said, loud enough to carry, well, there's the boneyard. The men on the deck laughed. It got repeated at the store. By the middle of January, there was not a soul between Ambler's Wharf and the county line who called assignment 217 anything else. I want to be honest with you about what Isham Toulson did and did not know at that point, because it would be easy to make him wiser than he was. And he was not wiser than he was. He did not know a thing about planting ground. He was a tonger. Tonguing is a craft of reading what is already there. You work the shafts open and closed with your wrists. 19 feet of white oak, and what comes up through your hands is not sight but hearing done with your arms. The hard rattling knock of a live rock, the dead soft push of mud, the grinding of a shell bed that has been worked too hard and is mostly boxes and rubble. A good tonger can put a boat on 8 feet of bottom in a fog and tell you within a rod where the rock quits. That is a real skill, and it takes a decade. It also tells you exactly nothing about how an oyster rock comes to exist in the first place. What changed was a conversation neither man intended to have. On the 9th of January, the dredge boat came in on a falling tide with a bad water pump, and Pink Bradish tied up at the Freetown landing because it was the nearest piling he could reach, which he was not happy about. Isham was on the landing, mending a culling board. Neither of them said anything for about 20 minutes. Then Pink, who could not stand silence any more than he could stand sitting still, said that if it was him, he would take Skiffington's $400 and be glad. Isham kept working. Isn't mine to take. It's dead ground, Toulson. It's rented ground. Pink spat over the side and said something then that he thought was an insult, and that Isham carried around for the next 4 months like a stone in his shoe. Rented, Pink said. You know what they'll do with it? Same as we do with all of it. Weather that shell up on the bank 2 winters till it's clean and white and it don't smell. Then run it back out and spread it thin as they can stand to. That's all planting is. You can't plant slick shell. Nothing takes hold of slick shell. 2 winters on the bank, then you got a rock where there wasn't one. He laughed. Except he's going to dump it on you first, and you'll thank him for the fill. He meant it as a joke about a man too poor to be worth robbing properly. That is genuinely all he meant. He was a decent enough man in the way of somebody who had never once in his life had to think about what a sentence would sound like from the other end of it. And if you had asked him a year later, he would not have remembered saying it. Isham Toulson remembered every word. Here is what Pink Bradish knew and did not know he was giving away. An oyster does not begin as an oyster. It begins as a larva no bigger than a grain of pepper, swimming free in the water column for somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks, feeding and being fed on, drifting with whatever the tide is doing. At the end of that time, the thing that has survived must find a hard, clean surface and cement itself to it within a matter of hours, or it dies. That is the whole of it. Not soil, not depth, not fertilizer, a surface, and the best surface in the world for it, the one the Chesapeake spent 10,000 years arranging, is the shell of an oyster that came before. Watermen called that surface culch, and the summer weeks when the larvae came down out of the water and took hold they called the set, or the strike. A barren bottom is not barren because the water is wrong. It is barren because there is nothing down there to hold on to. And a shell that comes fresh off a shucking house floor is greasy, has meat and blood and slime still on it, packs together, and silts over in a week. It has to lie out in the rain and the frost until the weather scours it clean, and the pile goes white and rings like crockery. 2 winters, Pink said. That was the trade's own number, arrived at by men who had never heard the word larva in their lives and did not need to. Isham did not have 2 winters. He had a bank of shell already going down onto his ground, fresh and slick and stinking, in the wrong place at the wrong tide. And he had a season coming. So he did the wrong thing first, which is what people do. Through the last of January and all of February 1924, he went out at low water with the shovel and worked that dumped shell out flat, breaking down the 6-foot bank, dragging it thin across the whole 14 acres, because thin was the one part of it he had understood correctly. It was the coldest work he had ever done, and he did it for 31 days. His hands split. Vashti went out with him on Saturdays and worked with a garden rake because it was what they had. The men on the packing house dock watched, and word got around that Isham Toulson had lost his mind out of grief and was farming mud. The set that summer came the 2nd week of July. He went out on the 29th with a pair of tongs and a wash tub, took 11 licks across the middle of the ground, and picked the shell over piece by piece on the culling board, with Vashti holding the tub steady. 4 spat, not 4 to a bushel, 4 altogether in 11 licks. He sat down on the washboard of the boat and looked at the water for a long time and did not say anything at all. And Vashti later said that was the only moment in 5 years she was afraid. The shell had gone down slick, packed flat and silted. It was a floor, not a rock. Everything he had done with his back for 31 days had made the ground smoother, tighter, and deeper than it was before he touched it. He told Delphi Cuffy that night, standing in her doorway because she did not care to have people sit. "Course it did," she said. "You laid it down like a road." Pink Bradish says 2 winters on the bank. "Then Pink Bradish knows something," she said, and went in and shut the door. That winter he did not touch the ground. He hauled instead, every load of shell he could beg or buy or catch coming off the dredge. And Skiffington was still dumping, still glad to be rid of it, still under the impression that he was burying a man. Isham took the shell up onto the high sand ridge behind the neck and built a bank of it 40 yards long and left it there, and let the rain and the frost of 1924 and 1925 get into it, and did not disturb it, and paid his $17.50 in January like always. He planted in the spring of 1925 and lost it in 9 days. The shell was right, clean, white, ringing, everything Pink said it should be. What was wrong was the water. He carried it out and spread it on the ebb, on the last of a big spring tide, because that was when the flats were dry enough to walk, and because nobody had ever told him it mattered. What runs off a bare flat on the back of a big spring ebb runs hard, and it runs toward the channel. He came back the following week, and the whole eastern half of his beautiful cured shell was gone, swept off the soft mud in a fan and piled up in the deep edge, 40 feet down, in water no tongs on the Mattaquin could reach. 211 bushels of shell, 2 winters of hauling, gone in 9 days into water he could see and could not touch. And that was the year the survey letter came. Letter came on the 4th of November, 1925. On state paper, in an envelope Vashti had to read out twice because her father would not take it from her hand the first time. It said that the Commissioner of Fisheries had received a petition for the resurvey of the eastern boundary of assignment number 217, Treadway County, and that a hearing would be held in Kilmarnock the following March, and that the assignee or his representative might appear. He appeared. He wore the suit he had married in, and he sat on a bench for 4 hours and 11 minutes. And when they called the assignment, he stood up and said the ground had been rented since 1911, and the rent had been paid every January. That was all he had. On the other side, there was a surveyor with a transit book, a plat, and a chain of reasoning about the 1894 line, and a sycamore stump that had been used as a reference monument and had since fallen into the river, and at the end of it the eastern boundary of Assignment 217 moved 140 feet west. 3 acres went out of his lease and into Skiffington and Sons. It was, everyone agreed, entirely legal, and it was the second time in 16 years that a survey had found in favor of the same packing house on the same river. 11 acres left and a whole season gone to it. Now I am going to stop the story here and turn it around, because you have been listening to it from one side of the water, and there is another side, and it is not the side you would write if you were making this up. Latimer Skiffington was not a cruel man, and he was not a stupid one. He had been running his father's house since 1908, and he knew things about the Mattaquin that nobody in Freetown Neck knew, because he saw them as numbers in a ledger, instead of as a bad day's tonguing. And what the numbers said was that the river was dying. Not slowly. His house had shucked its best year in 1904. By 1925, the public rocks in Treadway County were producing a little under a third of what they had produced when he took over. The boats were working longer for less, and the good tongers were going to Baltimore to work in the packing houses instead of on the water. Every man on the river blamed something different. The dredgers blamed the tongers. The tongers blamed the dredgers. Everybody blamed the state. And Latimer Skiffington, who had a head for arithmetic and no gift at all for saying uncomfortable things out loud, had worked out the real answer sometime around 1919 and had never once said it in public. The answer was shell. For 60 years the industry had been taking oysters out of the Chesapeake and shipping the meat north in cans and barrels, and it had been leaving the shell in a pile on the shore. Some of that shell was burned for lime. Some was ground for chicken feed. Some was spread on roads, and if you drove the county road from Ambler's Wharf to the courthouse in 1925, you drove 11 miles on the bones of the river. What almost none of it did was go back in the water. And a rock that never gets its shell back is a rock that gets thinner every year, because the only thing an oyster can grow on is an oyster, and every bushel landed was a bushel of foundation carried up the hill, and never brought down again. The river was being quarried. Latimer Skiffington understood that the trade he had inherited was quietly eating the ground it stood on. He had said as much, once, in a letter to the commissioner in 1921, and had received a courteous reply, and had let it go. So when he wanted Assignment 217, it was not to hurt anybody. He wanted it because it lay square between 2 pieces he already held, because his planting ground was running out, because 206 people in that county earned their winter money on his shucking floor, and because a lease held for 14 years by a woman who had never planted a bushel on it looked to him like 14 acres. The river could not afford to leave idle, and when Isham Toulson would not sell, Skiffington did the thing that men in his position have always done, which is that he let the pressure fall where it was cheapest to let it fall, and then did not look at it directly. He did not order shell dumped on 217. He told Pink Bradish to get the shell pile off his shore, and he never once asked where it went, and when he heard the word boneyard at the store he did not laugh, and he did not object. That is not the same as innocence, but it is what it was, and the difference matters to what happened next. Because a man who has been avoiding a thought for 6 years is a man who can be turned around by one fact, where a man who never had the thought at all cannot be turned around by anything. His son Ordway was 29 and had none of the doubt. Ordway wanted the 3 acres and would have wanted 30, back to the flats. In the spring of 1926, Isham Toulson had 11 acres, 211 bushels of shell at the bottom of the channel where he could not reach it, and a bank on the sand ridge that had been weathering since the winter of 1924. He also had, for the first time, a theory of what he was doing wrong, and it had 2 parts. And both of them came from watching where his own shell had gone. The first part was that he had been trying to cover 14 acres. He had spread everything he had as thin as it would go, across soft bottom and firm bottom alike, because more ground had sounded like more oysters. 14 acres of shell 1 layer deep is not a rock. It is a scatter. What he did in 1926 was take everything he had and put it on 4.5 acres at the western end, where the bottom was firmest, and put it down thick enough that a foot sank into it. The second part was the water. He had planted on the back of a big spring ebb, because that was when he could walk the flat, and the ebb had swept the flat clean, so he stopped walking it. He planted off the boat on the last of the flood into the slack, 4 scowloads across 3 days in the last week of May, shoveling over the side into water going nowhere at all, and let it settle before anything moved it. Then he waited. The set came the 3rd week of July 1926, and he did not go out and look for it. He went out on the 11th of September, 7 weeks after, when anything that had taken hold would have grown enough to see, and he took 4 licks with the tongs on the western ground, and turned the culling board over, and looked at it, and put his hat back on. Vashti said he counted for a while, and then said one word, which was enough, and then would not talk for the whole run home. There were 41 spat on a single shell. He told nobody, not Delphi, not the neck, not the store. The winter that followed was the closest he came to losing all of it, and it had nothing to do with the water. Shell has to be hauled, and hauling costs money, and a tonger who spends 4 months of every year moving other people's garbage up a sand ridge is a tonger who is not landing oysters. By January of 1927, he owed $19 at the store. The boat wanted a new shaft log, and Ordway Skiffington came down the sand road in his father's car with an offer of $240 for the transfer, $600 less than the number his father had put on the table in 1925. Offered in that particular tone men use when they believe a thing has gone bad, and they are doing you a favor by taking it away. Isham heard him out on the porch and did not ask him in. "It's dead ground, Toulson," Ordway said, which was the second time a man had said that exact sentence to him standing at a piece of his own property, and which told him more about how the county talked to itself than anything else he heard in 5 years. He paid the $17.50 in January like always. And then he did the thing that turned out to matter more than any of it, which was that he stopped working alone. Vashti was 19 in the summer of 1927 and had been culling for her father since she was 13, which meant she could sort a board faster than most grown men and knew nothing whatever about why any of it was there. That June, he started taking her out. On days, there was no money in it. He showed her the western ground and the soft eastern ground and made her put her hands on both through the tongs until she could tell them apart with her eyes shut. He showed her where the shell had gone in 1925 and made her look at the channel edge, 40 feet down, dark green, unreachable, so she would understand what a tide could do to 2 winters of work. And he taught her the calendar, which is the part no book had. A waterman in 1927 could not see an oyster larva and did not know one existed. What he had instead was a set of observations passed hand to hand for 200 years, and they were remarkably good. The set followed the heat, but it followed it late, roughly 10 days to 2 weeks behind the first stretch of water, warm enough that you did not flinch putting a wrist in it. It came in waves, not all at once, and a river could get 3 in a season or none. It liked the tail of a calm week better than the tail of a blowy one, and the newest spat, days old, could not be seen at all on a wet shell in daylight. You found it by running a thumbnail across the surface and feeling a roughness like the back of a stamp, and if you felt that you had a rock coming, and if you did not, you had a floor. He put her thumb on it himself, the first time, on the 11th of July, 1927, and did not tell her what she was feeling for until after she had found it. She said she felt it before she believed it. The other thing he gave her that summer was a tally book, a 5-cent ruled composition book from the store at Ambler's Wharf, and a rule about it that he never once bent. Every lick they took on that ground got written down. The date, the stage of the tide, the place on the ground, the number of licks, the count off 1 bushel, and the weather that week. In her handwriting, not his, because his was slow and hers was not, and because a man who has been told for 3 years that he is farming mud develops a certain feeling about paper with his own numbers on it. That book ran from July of 1927 to November of 1934 without a gap. It is the only reason anybody afterward could say with any precision what happened on those 11 acres. And it is the reason that when a state inspector eventually stood on that culling board with his own book open, the figures he wrote down were not a surprise to the 2 people standing beside him. They already knew. They had known for 2 years. What they had never had and what a man's own composition book cannot buy him anywhere on this earth, was a witness the county was obliged to believe. He planted again in 1927 and again in 1928 with everything he could haul, and the whole county went on calling it the boneyard, and Pink Bradish went on running the dredge boat, except that sometime in the autumn of 1927, Pink stopped dumping on 217. He never announced it. He never said a word about it to Skiffington, who never asked. He just began carrying the shell a half-mile further down and putting it over on a piece of dead bottom off Marl Point that belonged to nobody, and when one of his own crew asked him why, he said the tide was better there, which was not true and which nobody argued with. Delphi Cuffey was 77 in the fall of 1928, and she had not been down to the landing in 2 years. Isham went up the sand road on the 19th of October with a single oyster in his coat pocket, wrapped in a piece of newspaper because it was still wet. It was 3 years old, deep-cupped, heavy, with a shell so hard he had to work the knife twice, and it had grown its whole life cemented to a piece of shell that had come off Latimer Skiffington's shucking floor. He put it on her table and opened it in front of her and did not say anything. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "Off 217, off 217. She did not cry, and she did not smile. She picked up the shell and turned it over and looked at the underside, at the scar where it had held on, and she said, "Ground's got bones in it now." And she ate it, and she asked him what the rent was up to. Delphi Cuffey died in the second week of February 1929, of nothing more dramatic than being 77 in a cold house. She was buried out of the church at Freetown Neck on a Thursday. The assignment was still in her name. It had been in her name for 18 years. The count came 8 months later. Every 2 years, the commissioner's office sent an inspector down the western shore to sample the assigned grounds, not for the assignee's benefit, but for the state's, because the rent was fixed, and the state wanted to know what its barren bottom was actually doing. The inspector for the Mattaquin in 1929 was a thin, careful, unhurried man named Ryland Massey, who had been doing it for 9 years, and who had a reputation on both shores for 2 things. He wrote down what he found, and he did not care whose ground it was. He came to assignment 217 on the 8th of October, 1929, and because it was the last stop of his day, and because Skiffington and Sons Dock was the only place on that stretch to tie up a state boat, half the packing house came out to watch. Massey's method was the same everywhere, and it was not complicated. He took a fixed number of licks, with the tongs at set points across the ground, culled the haul onto the board, weighed off a bushel of the shell that came up, and counted every spat and every young oyster on it, and wrote the figure in a book. Then he did the same on the nearest natural rock as a control, so the office in Newport News could compare planted bottom against public bottom in the same water on the same day. Marl Point Rock, public bottom, 0.8 of a mile east, went first, 31 to the bushel. Then he ran back west and put his boat on the west end of the boneyard, and he took his licks, and he culled the board, and he started counting, and he stopped, and he counted the same bushel over again from the beginning. 214. Nobody on the dock said anything at all. Isham Toulson, who was 21 that year, and who had culled every one of those licks, stood at the end of the board with her hands flat on the wood and did not move, and she said afterward that the thing she remembered was not the number but the sound of the water against the boat, which she had never once noticed in her life before that morning. Latimer Skiffington came down off the dock and out along the culling board in a good coat, and stood there looking at the shell for what Massey later estimated was 1.5 minutes. Then he said, "How long did you leave it on the bank?" 2 winters. Skiffington nodded slowly once. He did not say anything else. He did not congratulate him, did not apologize, did not mention the 3 acres or the survey or the sycamore stump, and he went back up the dock and into his office and shut the door. And that was the whole of it. But he had asked the question out loud, in front of 11 witnesses and a state inspector, and every man standing there understood exactly what a question like that means. You do not ask a man his method unless you have already decided he has one. Isham Toulson took 1,417 bushels off 11 acres in the 1929 and 1930 season at $1.15 at the wharf, $1,629.55 in a year when the rest of the country was coming apart. Off ground the county had named for a place where things are thrown when they are finished with. What happened after that is the part that outlasted all of them. In the spring of 1930, Skiffington and Son stopped selling its shell pile for road metal and stopped paying to have it dumped and started paying instead to have it weathered on the shore and carried back out. Latimer Skiffington did not present this as anybody's idea but his own, and Isham Toulson did not appear to expect anything different. Pink Bradish hauled it. Within 4 years there were 3 houses on that river doing the same thing, and the state had begun a shell planting program of its own. And men who had spent 30 years watching the rocks thin out found themselves with a thing to do about it, which is not the same as a cure, and the Chesapeake's troubles were only beginning. But it was the first year in 60 that more shell went into that river than came out of it. The 1934 chart of the oyster grounds of Treadway County was printed in Richmond from the surveys of the commissioner's office, and it named every rock and every assigned ground on the Mattaquin the way the local men called them, because that is how charts get made. Assignment 217 is on it, in 6-point type, under the name Boneyard. Vashti Toulson had that chart in a frame until she was an old woman, and she used to say that her father never once put it on a wall. He kept it rolled in the boat, in a piece of oilcloth, and used it, because it was a working chart, and he was a working man. He did one other thing that fall, in November of 1934, and nobody watched him do it, because he did not tell anybody he was going. He loaded a scow with weathered shell, 3 years on the bank, white, clean, ringing, and he ran it 1.5 miles up the river to the piece of soft bottom off, 9-foot knoll, where a woman had tonged for 28 years before a chain, and a transit found 30 rods that had been sitting in the wrong place all along. That bottom was not leased, it was not his. Nothing he put down there would ever be his, and any man in the county with a license and a set of tongs could work it forever. Which was, when you thought about it for a second, exactly the point. He spread the whole scowload and came home. I have been telling stories about people who worked with their hands for a long while now, and if there is one thing I have learned that surprises me still, it is how often the thing a man needs turns out to have been thrown at him. Not given. Thrown. The county threw dead shell at Isham Toulson because it was the cheapest way it had of telling him to go somewhere else. And he stood out on that flat in January with a shovel and took the message apart and found underneath the insult the one material on this earth his ground had been starving for. That did not make the insult a kindness. It stayed an insult. But he was not in a position to be choosy about where his foundations came from, and I would guess most of us never are. The part I keep coming back to, though, is the last load. He was 51 years old. He had his 11 acres and his name on a state chart, and a daughter who could tong as well as he could. And he took a scow of good cured shell that he could have planted on his own ground and put it down on bottom that belonged to everybody, over a rock that had been taken from an old woman in 1909 and never given back. Nobody paid him for it. Nobody wrote it in a book. There is no way in the world he could have known whether anything would ever set there at all. He put it down anyway. That is a kind of faith, and I do not know a better word for it. The people, the places, and the businesses in this story are invented, and the story itself is fiction, built on the real trades, the real laws, and the real water of the Chesapeake, but invented all the same. Thank you for spending this time on the river with me.